Okay, welcome back to the weather course. We have two speakers today, and neither one of them are meteorologists, but that's okay. Bob Palmer is our first speaker, and he was a staff director of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Space, Science, and Technology. And the National Weather Service was one of the federal agencies that came under the jurisdiction of that committee. And he was involved in a lot of policy and budgetary fights involving the Weather Service. So another agency that came under the committee's jurisdiction was NASA, and he was heavily involved in the committee's investigation of the 1986 Challenger incident, and that's what he will be discussing today. And I might as well introduce the second speaker right at the same time. Our second speaker is Jerry Kirkpatrick, and he's a retired U.S. Navy captain and retired attorney at law. And he received law degrees from College William and Mary and George Washington University. He was director of academics at the Naval Justice School and taught graduate level international law in the Naval War College in Rhode Island. He's past president of the Pentagon chapter of the Federal Bar Association and served in the Pentagon as a special counsel and military assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. And so today he will discuss the importance of weather during wartime. So first off is Bob Palmer.
Take that. Turn it on first. Thank you, Jane. Thank you all for coming. Jane's put together a great series on weather, and it may shock you to learn that Jerry is not a meteorologist, and neither am I. But we're going to talk about weather anyway. The series has been dealing a lot with weather forecasting, weather science. We're not going to talk about either of those things either. So we're departing from that. People hear about weather and its impact on history, and you may think about civilizations that have crashed because of weather-related incidents. That's really more a climate matter than weather. And we're also not going to talk about some of the sort of famous weather disasters, one-off events. I'm thinking the Johnstown flood, the Galveston hurricane. I learned something preparing this about the Great Flood in California in 1862. I don't know, does anybody know about that? Heard about it? I hadn't. It's the Central Valley was underwater, like 6,000 square miles, totally underwater. It was one of those atmospheric rivers that came across and flooded the West Coast. And the governor was going to his inauguration, Leland Stanford, after whom the university is named. Leland had to go in a rowboat to the state capitol in Sacramento to get sworn in as governor. That's how bad that was. But what I'm gonna talk about is civil events that were shaped by weather. Jane mentioned is going to talk about military events. I'm going to talk mostly about two. One was in 1620. Maybe you can guess what that was. And the other one I'm going to talk about, as Jane referred to, was January 28th, 1986. And I can never forget the day or the month because it's actually Mary's birthday, January 26th. So, this thing going here. Yeah. So this is the first event I'm going to talk about, 1620, the voyage of the Mayflower. This is a book that's down in the library downstairs, and I took it out because I thought I'd read the first 5 pages and read about the weather conditions on the Mayflower's journey. I ended up reading the whole book. I'd encourage people to take it out of the library and read it. It's really an amazing book. It goes through the journey, but also it covers about the next 60 years, terminating in King Philip's War between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims and engulfed most of New England. And if you look at percentage of people killed or that died in the conflict, King Philip's War is probably the bloodiest war in American history. It's just a brutal, awful, awful war. Hello. Was that you, dear? All right, you're divorced. Advance, you little bugger. Huh. There we go. Doesn't work there? I guess not. Oh, okay. Forgive me. I'm not technically that literate, obviously. All right. This is the Mayflower, a book titled The Perilous Voyage That Changed the World. We'll talk about that. You see on the right the dates. It started out in September of 1620. They landed in Massachusetts. Over 2 months later, if you calculate their average speed, it was 2 miles an hour. So can you imagine packed into that ship going 2 miles an hour for 2.5 months? Pretty brutal stuff. Part of the problem was they left late, and there's an element there of sabotage, which I can discuss in the questions if people are interested, but I'll leave that for now. But one of the reasons it took so long was the weather was awful, and they got blown off course, which is why this is a weather event that shaped future history. Here's a map of New England and down to New York. This is the mouth of the Hudson River. That's actually where the Mayflower was trying to go. They were going to settle that area. It was not settled at that time in 1620. They got blown off course. You can see up in the upper right, they landed at the end of Cape Cod in Provincetown, which was a pretty inhospitable place at the time. You see those arrows, they tried to make it out of there and go down to New York, but they made a couple of tries. They turned back. The weather was awful. The shoals were awful, and they were unmapped. So after putzing around there for about a month, they went to the west to Plymouth, which you can maybe see. See if this pointer works. No? This is a very tiny little pointer. Yeah, I'm seeing where to hold it, but it's... There we go. There's Plymouth. There's Boston, which is where they should have gone. But anyway, they went around Cape Cod Bay and they ended up in Plymouth, obviously. As I said, they were headed for New York. There was no permanent settlement in New England at that point. There was settlement, obviously, in North America widely, but nothing in New England. They were ill-equipped, really, when they landed. There were only about 50 pilgrims in the crew of the ship. They didn't know how to fish. They didn't know how to whale. They did get help from the Indians. They were also greatly helped by the fact that there were very few Native Americans left. A huge proportion of the native population had died in the 3 or 4 years before they landed from Western diseases, probably borne by fishermen who fished off Cape Cod and all up in New England. But anyway, Plymouth is important. This event, them getting blown off course by the weather and settling where they did, obviously had significant implications. The Mayflower Compact was entered into there. We obviously have the Thanksgiving service, which we observe today, which sort of honors the first meal that they had with the Native Americans. And the holiday was, probably most people know, was inaugurated and declared whatever by Abraham Lincoln, 1862. By the way, there's no mention in any of the early reports of anybody landing on a rock. Plymouth Rock doesn't really exist. I mean, you can go in Plymouth today and there's a piece of a rock there, but probably has absolutely no relation to anything they did in 1620. So it's, you know, the implications are kind of obvious that the Dutch settled in New York rather than the Pilgrims, and the Dutch weren't expelled for another 45 years. So that changed some things. There were 3 English-Dutch wars in the meantime. That probably never would have happened. And the King Philip's War and all the slaughters in New England may never have happened had they actually landed in the correct place. So that's the first major weather event. As I said, there's a second one in 1986 I'm going to address in a few minutes, but let me hit a few other weather-related historical events quickly. Gabriel's rebellion, August 30th, 1800. Gabriel was an enslaved man in Virginia, and he and his co-conspirators had a plan to march into Richmond, take over the Virginia Armory, the state capitol, grab James Monroe, who was not president but governor, hold him hostage, and negotiate for their freedom. And they probably had enough weapons and bodies to do that. But heavy rains hit, and they had to delay their mission. They couldn't get through the roads with mud and so forth. And word spread around, their plot got exposed. They got captured rather than capturing Monroe. They themselves got captured. Gabriel and 25 of his co-conspirators were hanged. And the upshot about this is Virginia and a number of other states passed significant restrictions on enslaved people in terms of assembly, education, and so forth, really beat down what remaining rights there for enslaved persons as a result of this rebellion. So it had significant impacts. The next one, I think you probably recognize the dirigible Hindenburg. This is somewhat controversial, but it was filled with hydrogen, not helium. And the reason was sources of helium at that time were mostly from the United States. And we had cut off supplies of helium to Germany. Germany had used dirigibles in World War I, and that's probably why the supplies were cut off. The theories on why it crashed and burned or burned and crashed are variable, but one of them relates to the thunderstorms that were in the area at the time, setting up electrical static charges. And when they dropped the ropes to moor the ship, the principal theory is that it caused a spark that ignited the hydrogen, and you can see the result. But the amazing thing is there were 90 people on board, only 35 of them died. It's hard to imagine anybody survived that, but the majority actually did. It was strictly a luxury perk to take this trip. This was a 3-day trip from Berlin to New York City. Cost $400, which is, 6 or 8, 10 grand today. So it's very expensive. But obviously this sort of put an end to that kind of travel. But it was, it was a legitimate form of luxury travel that disappeared in 1 minute. JFK, another weather event. November 22nd, 1963, we probably all remember it. It was supposed to be rainy. The forecast from the Weather Bureau was rain, thunderstorms, messy day. They got into the early afternoon, the sun came out, and it was beautiful. So President Kennedy said, I don't need this plexiglass dome on my limousine. Take it down. I want to see the people. I want the people to see me. They removed the plexiglass dome, which may or may not have saved his life. We'll never know. Was not a bulletproof dome, but the bullet may have been deflected. It's hard to say. Plexiglass may have shattered and killed everybody. We don't know, but the point is there was no dome. And it was a changed weather situation that led to Kennedy making that decision. The space shuttle. Well, isn't this strange? Look at all the snow on the ground. But that's the space shuttle, isn't it? The answer is no, that's the Buran. The Soviets built basically their own shuttle. Looked very much like the US shuttle. It flew once in 1988, two orbits of uncrewed orbits of the Earth. I was actually in Kazakhstan in 1991, and this Buran was in a hangar there. It only flew the one flight. And then they stopped the program shortly after I saw it on the ground. And in 2002, the roof of the hangar collapsed and destroyed the Buran. So that was a one-off flight. The shuttle, I guess I can talk about this briefly now. The shuttle and the Buran had sort of similar missions, which was deploying, capturing satellites. We thought the shuttle, and our shuttle got, the design of our shuttle was tweaked significantly by the Defense Department. We always think of the NASA functions of the shuttle, but it had defense functions. And some of the original concept for the shuttle was it would capture Russian satellites in orbit. I think the Buran had the same thought, capture US satellites in orbit. That never really happened, but it resulted in the case of the shuttle in significant redesign of the shuttle, which actually didn't really help with its NASA type missions. Anyway, that's not the shuttle. Back to Mary's birthday in 1986. This is the crew of the Challenger. And of course, the most famous crew member was the lady on the left, Krista McAuliffe, who was the teacher in space. And this was a program NASA came up with to fly a teacher on subsequent missions. You know, at this point, the shuttle had flown 24 times already. People, I think, were getting bored with it. It needed a little PR jolt, and NASA came up with the idea of a teacher in space. And the first one and the only one was Krista McAuliffe. You see the other crew members there. The third person from the left, Judy Resnick, is from Akron, Ohio, which is my hometown. She was a PhD engineer, actually. There's the shuttle on the morning of the launch. You know, it's a very complicated vehicle system. It's a remarkable achievement. What it accomplished over time. I mentioned the changes that the Defense Department put into it, and the fact that the Buran had very similar missions. Let me see if I can get this thing to work. These are the solid rocket boosters, two of them at the sides of the shuttle. And the current launch vehicle that NASA is going to use to put a few people around the moon in a few months essentially uses these. This system's different, but the solid rocket motors are pretty much retained. I don't believe they're recoverable. Those were actually recoverable. But the solid rocket boosters, as you probably remember, and we'll talk about here in a minute, are the villain in this piece. We all probably remember what happened to SDS-51. Well,
9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it is cleared the tower. Program. Roger, Challenger. Engine throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. 1:15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
chilling video. So the culprit of these solid rocket boosters, they're in pieces. There are what are called field joints holding them together with a tang and clevis connection, it's called. And in there, in the sections that are held together, is a giant O-ring, which is, I don't know, 20 feet in diameter or something. And as the solid rocket boosters flex, the O-ring is supposed to fill in any gaps in there and prevent the escape of gas, because if this hot gas comes out and it's very hot, it could burn like the connection of the solid rocket motor to the rest of the vehicle, which is exactly what happened. Burned right through the connection and the vehicle came apart. So what became clear in the investigation later was the impact of temperature on those O-rings in the solid rocket boosters. This is some of the temperature data from Florida on the morning of January 28th, 1986. You can probably read those. 19 degrees here in Gainesville. The two from the bottom, air temperature at liftoff was 38. But the estimated temperature around the failed rocket booster was 28, and probably even colder than that, because they were venting hydrogen before the launch, which is very cold. And some of the estimates are as low as 6 or 8 degrees in the region of that solid rocket booster. So what happens when the O-rings made out of a rubber-like material gets exposed to 28 degrees or 8 degrees or whatever it was?
Before the event, from information that was available and understanding that was available, was it fully appreciated everywhere that this seal would become unsatisfactory at some temperature, and was there some sort of a suggestion of a temperature at which the SRB, I guess you call it, yes, shouldn't be run?
Yes, sir. There was a suggestion of that. To answer the first question, given the configuration that we ran, that the seal would function at that temperature. That was the final judgment.
But Commission member Richard Feynman, after examining the O-ring, had a surprise.
Oh, I took this stuff that I got out of your seal and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it maintains, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for our problem.
It has some significance. He was right. Feynman, of course, brilliant Nobel Prize winner in physics, got on that investigative panel chaired by Mr. Rogers, former Secretary of State under Nixon. And he was kind of a burr in the side of Rogers and some of the other commission members, but you know, he ran a 6th grade experiment and he kind of broke the code. Brilliant guy. he didn't have long to live by. He didn't really want to get on the panel. He was dying of cancer, but he got on and he did his job and he did it really well. So the cold exacerbated the bad design with the O-rings, caused the crash. But there were these other contributing factors. A long history of ignoring the O-ring problem. The folks that made the SRBs, Morton Thiokol out in Utah, they knew they had a problem and they were working on a fix. They just hadn't fixed it yet. And part of the issue is there were so many potential points of failure on the shuttle, the engines, the brakes. You can run down the list. It was real engineering judgment to figure out what to spend your money on. And they obviously didn't spend enough on the O-rings because after the crash, they redesigned them and fixed the whole thing in a matter of months. But they didn't have the resources to do it. Pressure to launch. They were getting a lot of heat from Congress, which is where I was at the time, from the press, because they were constantly delaying flights. And, there were lots of reports in the press essentially mocking NASA for when are you going to launch these things? And there was also a theory never proven that the White House wanted to have a link in President Reagan's State of the Union speech to Christa McAuliffe and have the president talk to the teacher in space as part of his State of the Union speech. And the State of the Union, I think, was that night, actually. And that was briefly investigated, but certainly never proven one way or the other. At pre-launch decision-making, the Thiokol engineers were actually at the Space Center the night before and unanimously recommended against a launch. He said, it's too cold. We have no history at these temperatures. We shouldn't be launching. These were the engineers that knew the design of the solid rocket boosters better than anybody. They got kind of leaned on by NASA management. And the executives at Thiokol, not the engineers, the executives who had originally supported their engineers caved and said, okay, launch it. The NASA guy in charge was quoted as saying something like, when the hell are we supposed to launch this, in April? Mockingly addressing the Thiokol engineers. So, Richard Feynman quote, I won't read. Longer Richard Feynman quote. The heading of that 1 in 100,000, I remember this when I was in DC at the time. NASA officials said, well, what are the odds of an accident? And the answer was, we've done all the numbers, it's 1 in 100,000. In reality, there were 2 accidents and 135 flights, so that's 1 in 67, which is slightly different than 1 in 100,000. There was a failure in the shuttle, the Challenger launch, rather, which was number 25 of 135. And there was also the Columbia, which was mission 113 of 135. So there were another 20 or so Challenger missions after the Columbia failure that went off uneventfully. We used to go down to Paynes Prairie and look to the east and watch the launches from Paynes Prairie. It was really magnificent. The shuttle was 80, 100 miles away, and you could see it lift off brilliantly, and you could see it for 6 or 7 minutes as it headed out to the northeast over the Atlantic. It's quite amazing. One last little factoid. I guess it was the flight right before the Challenger. One of the crew members was Bill Nelson, later senator in Florida, later administrator of NASA in the Biden administration. Nelson's flight, he was very lucky to survive. They postponed the flight at the last minute, and it was lucky they did because there was some hardware that was not where it was supposed to be. And the consensus after the flight was, had they launched, that probably would have cracked. So Mr. Nelson survived by the skin of his teeth, basically. And I would suggest we hold questions until Jerry finishes his, and then one or both of us can answer your questions. So Jerry, why don't you take over? You want this?
Thanks. I'll see if I can work this high-tech instrument here. All right, I think I know what to do. I'll start off by saying that I'm not a real fan of the hand mic because of this, and I have a tendency to talk with my hands. So let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll be happy to adjust. Okay. As you can see, I'm Weatherman 2, and it's a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. And thank you, Bob. I certainly learned a lot from your presentation, a lot about these events, and I had no idea about them. To understand the relationship between military operations and the weather, we start with a very simple exercise in logic. And we start with a premise. And the premise is that military operations involve movement outdoors. Now, the slide says almost always. I was being far too technical. I think we can say, as a matter of a sound premise, that military operations involve movement outdoors. And you can see in these depictions of what we're talking about here, movement outdoors, from aircraft to ground troops to operations of warships at sea. Okay, right. And then we can go to a second premise that says that outdoor movement is subject to weather. And we all know that. It's true in the military context, and it's true in the civilian context. Think about events that are canceled because of the weather, sporting events and so on. Businesses, schools closed because of ice and snow. We saw that this past weekend in the Carolinas, for example. So outdoor activities and outdoor movement is subject to weather. So from that, just by applying a simple logic, we can conclude that military operations are subject to weather. They always have been, they are now, and they likely always will be, so long as these military operations occur on Earth or are subject to the Earth's atmosphere. Once we get out into outer space, it'll be a different story, but that's for another day. Here's an example of a very recent event where weather affected a military operation. It was New Year's Eve, and elite Army commandos were on standby in the Caribbean, poised to storm an armored safe house in Caracas to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. But the weather wasn't perfect. So the operation was put on hold, and two days later, January 2nd, the weather cleared and President Trump gave the go-ahead and the military operation took place. And there's Maduro. He was captured and he's now in New York City awaiting trial. So that's a very recent event. But effects of weather on military operations can likely go back to the first time that cavemen started throwing rocks at each other. I mean, that's how far back it goes. Weather has always affected armed conflict throughout the ages. Now, here's an interesting depiction. And it's interesting to note that that warfare was a seasonal matter up until the Industrial Revolution, and certainly during the Civil War. And what you see here is a depiction of an army in winter quarters. Armies broke off their armed conflict when the weather got cold, and they went into winter quarters. Now, this is the type of Army winter quarters that General Washington and his Continental Army likely experienced at Valley Forge in the winter of 1776. And even with modern technology, armies and equipment have been bogged down by mud, rain, snow, freezing temperatures, ice, and World Wars I and II, the Korean conflict, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan are full of such stories. In the Korean War, for example, the Army estimates that 20 to 30% of all the casualties in the Korean War were related to the weather. Here we see American troops enduring the extremely cold winters of Korea on the Korean Peninsula during the Korean conflict. In the naval context, storms at sea can bring operations to a halt, in some cases damage and sink ships with attendant loss of life. The destruction you see here was not caused by enemy action. It was caused by the weather. Historians estimate that throughout history, more troops were lost to causes attributed to the weather than actual combat. And there are accounts that have been published from the Peloponnesian War, the exploits of Alexander the Great, the march of Roman legions, Ottoman conquest, naval battles involving the Spanish Armada. Every conflict has its stories, and many of these stories have been published in papers and studies by the Army War College and the Naval War College, and by the U.S. Army Medical Department Center for History and Heritage. So there are lots of reports out there that address this very thing, the impact of weather over the ages on armed conflict. Now we're going to talk about how weather affects armed conflict, and it does in two general categories. It has an effect on the combatant forces themselves, and it also has an effect on logistics. Armies and military formations of any kind need to be supplied and resupplied. And if they're not, then the combatant forces themselves sometimes are of very little use. Without supplies, military operations can grind to a halt. And here we see that halting advances in air operations, destroying fleets, can cause mass casualties, as we see here, and mass destruction. I want to talk for a minute about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. We all know that. We all remember it, at least learning about the history of it. And weather provided what I call a two-sided coin with regard to this specific attack. And by that, here's what I mean. On the one hand, weather provided a benefit. It provided a benefit to the Japanese. When the Japanese planes flew over Hawaii, the weather was perfectly clear. The Japanese pilots had a complete, they were able to see their targets clearly, and they were able to execute upon their targets with great effect, largely because of the weather. The weather was so favorable. But flip the coin over, and we find that weather had a hampering effect, because for the entire week before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Navy surveillance planes were trying to find the Japanese fleet. They scoured the Pacific Ocean with no effect because of heavy cloud cover. The Japanese were maintaining radio silence, and they couldn't be seen from the air because of the heavy cloud cover. Now, it's not because the Americans anticipated the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. They did not. but they had intercepted cryptic codes from the Japanese that indicated a likelihood of surprise attack on Midway Island. So they're out there looking for this Japanese fleet. They couldn't find it because of the bad weather. The bad weather can sometimes give one side an advantage over the enemy. And here we go back to 1776, that brutal winter of 1776, when the Continental Army was in winter quarters at Valley Forge. Well, on Christmas night, December 25th, 1776, Washington and his troops crossed the Delaware River and attacked the British and the Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. It was a complete surprise and a complete victory for General Washington. He quickly went on to attack Princeton and was again successful. These attacks raised the morale of the dispirited American troops and played a large contribution toward turning the events of the war, turning the tide of the war. Here, this is interesting. I didn't know this until I was looking into things in connection with today's presentation. Nagasaki was not the original target for the second atomic bomb attack. The city of Kokura was. But again, it was shrouded in clouds and fog because the weather couldn't be attacked. So they went to Plan B. Plan B was to drop the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and that's exactly what happened. Even today, and I want to emphasize this point because I experienced it in my naval service. Defense contractors and the military, they count all these weapon systems as being all-weather capable. Oh, we have all-weather capable fighters. We have all-weather capable attack planes, another weapon system. Well, guess what? They're not. They're not. Weather can be a real showstopper. Weather can stop military operations in their tracks, and I have seen it. For example, look at this aircraft carrier. Try to launch or recover aircraft from that platform. I can tell you from my 6 years serving on aircraft carriers, it can't be done. It's impossible. And similar conditions can happen even with land-based aircraft because of weather conditions. They can put a dead stop to a well-planned and organized military operation. I'll just give you one example from my own personal experience. In 1989, I was on the USS Midway, and we were in the Sea of Japan. And flight operations were scheduled for the day. There was a window of opportunity to use a bombing range and a target range for training purposes. Everything was set to go. The hangar deck crews were all made and ready. The flight deck crews, aircraft were armed with munitions. They were all fueled up. Steam was generated so they could operate the catapults. But guess what? Nothing happened. Why? Because the elevators that were used from taking aircraft between the hangar deck and the flight deck were frozen solid. The mechanisms were frozen solid and the elevators couldn't work. They couldn't move the aircraft. What was to be done? There was great, wringing of hands and, oh my goodness. And, who's going to get blamed for this and so on and so on. Well, one of the engineers came up with the idea, let's run a steam line to each of the elevators. And that's what was done. But it took time. It took hours. And by then the window of opportunity was lost and that training opportunity was lost. That's just another example of how weather can affect the military operation. But again, this is a great picture, and thank you, Dick. Dick is my producer, by the way, back here, and I want to give a shout out to Dick. He came up with this photo, but this photo illustrates it beautifully. Common sense. Try to launch aircraft or recover aircraft off of that. You just can't do it. Okay? In addition to warfighting itself, and this is the second aspect, armies need to be resupplied. Naval forces need to be resupplied. Air forces need to be resupplied. It takes food. It takes equipment. It takes fuel. All of these things are necessary to sustain the combatant forces. If the supplies can't get through, then the combatant forces are of little value. Here you see two photos of resupply, one by aircraft and one by ship. There have been numerous stories, again, from all the different conflicts of how resupply made the difference between victory and defeat in a given battle. When supplies couldn't get through, the combatant forces were greatly compromised in their effectiveness. So in the meantime, in the time I have remaining, I want to talk about briefly about two events from World War II in which weather played a decisive factor. In the first case, which is D-Day, it played a very positive factor. In the second, it played a very tragic factor. It led to destruction and massive loss of life. But first, let's talk about D-Day. Planners determined that in order for the D-Day invasion to be successful, the D-Day landings had to be conducted during these conditions: low tide, low sea state, which means relatively calm waters, light winds, and a full moon. And there was a window that was determined by the meteorologist, and that window was June 5th, 6th, and 7th in 1944. So based on that, all months of planning occurred, and months of maneuver occurred. They had to move forces all around England. They had to bring forces from the U.S. over to England. They had to bring them from other places they were amassed and get them all ready to go in England and get their conveyances ready to take them across the channel to land on the beaches of Norway. And everything depended upon this particular window of opportunity, June 5th, 6th, and 7th. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander, and he relied heavily on his team of meteorologists to advise him on this window of opportunity, which they did. And again, it was set based on that. The D-Day, the day of departure for Normandy, was set to be June 5th, 1944. Forces were alerted, everything was set to go. However, the plan changed on June 3rd because from a weather station on the west coast of Ireland, forecasters saw an approaching storm, a bad one. And 600 miles at sea out in the Atlantic, the British ship confirmed the report and reported deteriorating conditions heading toward the British Isles and with a strong likelihood of continuing on over the channel. What was supposed to be done? Eisenhower's team of meteorologists were worried, and they were divided on what to do because they were getting data and information from various sources, and some of it was conflicting. So what were they supposed to do? They were kind of in a tizzy. They didn't know what to do. So there was this indecision, there was wringing of hands. What was to be done? Forecasting was rudimentary in those days compared to what it is now. The tools that forecasters have now, sophisticated weather radar, didn't exist. Okay? Satellites, of course, did not exist. Computer models did not exist. It was very rudimentary. They relied on surface observations, weather balloons, and instruments, rather important, but that's what they had: thermometers, barometers, hydrometers, and that's what they had to work with. This was all state of the art at the time. So they're doing the best they can, but there were a lot of unknowns, a lot of things that were undetermined. So it wasn't like forecasting today. So Supreme Allied Headquarters was in a tizzy. All was ready to go. But Eisenhower was reticent. He did not want to be responsible for the major fiasco of World War II. So he was being very cautious. And he feared a catastrophe. And he let it be known to his staff what was to be done. Headquarters, again, was in a tizzy. And here you see some of his top advisors huddled around him. So what was to be done? Well, here we go. As soon as I get the right button. Enter this man. Take a good look. Take a real good look at Group Captain James M. Stagg, Royal Air Force Voluntary Reserve. A severe, serious, stout Scot. A man who took his work and his life seriously. A man not to be trifled with. A man who did not suffer fools graciously. Look at this man. You think he takes things in a frivolous manner? I don't think so. Neither did anybody else. All right, here he is. Group Captain James M. Stagg, Doctor of Science from Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh. A seasoned meteorologist, a teacher of science, head of Britain's Arctic expedition in 1932 and 1933. Honored by the King by being appointed to Order of the Bath, Order of the British Empire, and later honored by President Roosevelt as being appointed an officer of the Legion of Merit of the United States. Members of the meteorological team were all over the place, and they were wringing their hands, and they were saying, I think we should hold off. And they said, look, there's another window of opportunity coming later in the month, from the 18th to the 20th. It's true, it won't be a full moon, but the tides will be low. What about the sea state? They didn't know. They couldn't forecast the sea state that far in advance back in those days. I don't even know if it could be done today. But they were counseling. The meteorological team was counseling. Oh, no, General, you better hold off. No, we better try it again later in the month. But again, there had been months and months of planning, maneuver all through England and from the United States to England, getting ready for this invasion. But what did this man do? Nonsense, said Group Captain Stagg. The weather will clear on June 6th. The invasion must go forward. He said it with such conviction and authority that General Eisenhower listened. As we know, the rest is history. All right. There's another weather event that I want to use in wrapping up, and it is Typhoon Cobra, December 1944. The storm occurred in the Philippine Sea, where the Third Fleet was operating under the command of Admiral William F. Bull Halsey. The fleet was operating against Japanese air bases in the Philippines, and weather information was sent to Admiral Halsey. He was the fleet commander, but it was ambiguous. Yeah, a storm was coming, but how severe was it? It was questionable. Some sources said it's going to be a doozy. Others are saying, I think he can ride it out. So he was receiving conflicting information. The storm was Typhoon Cobra, with winds reaching 160 miles per hour. It was not a tepid storm by any stretch. The ships were low on fuel because they had been engaged in combat operations for days against the Japanese in the Philippines. And when a ship is low on fuel or has no fuel, it's nothing more than a bobbing cork in the ocean. It can't make headway. So Halsey ordered the continuation of refueling operations right into the heart of the storm. But again, what was he supposed to do? What was the alternative? Again, you couldn't just leave the ship sit there because they'd be dead in the water. And a ship dead in the water is in a very dangerous situation because it can't make headway. The storm hit Halsey's fleet like a ton of bricks. And here you see some of the damage. Again, not by enemy action, but by weather. He had a large, huge flotilla. 7 large fleet aircraft carriers, 6 smaller escort carriers, 8 battleships, 50 cruisers, and 50 destroyers. A huge naval flotilla. Of these, 3 destroyers capsized and were sunk. 32 other ships, including 4 aircraft carriers, suffered heavy damage. 146 aircraft were tossed into the sea or suffered fatal damage, which means they were pushed over the side, and 790 sailors lost their lives. Soon after, the Navy convened a court of inquiry, which found that Admiral Halsey committed an error of judgment, but it stopped short of finding that he was negligent. I want to talk about this for a minute or two because it's a very important distinction. The court of inquiry is not a court martial. It's an administrative hearing to take testimony and develop facts and opinions and recommendations. And that's what was held. It was held on a small island called Ulithi in the Carolines. And it was held on board a destroyer tender called the USS Cascade. And during this court of inquiry, it was such an important proceeding that Admiral Nimitz felt that it was important for him to fly from Hawaii to where the court of inquiry was being held and to show his presence there. He was not a member of the court, but he sat in the back of the room with his arms crossed, and he was a very heavy influence. And naval historians and analysts many of them have come to the conclusion that the court's finding that, yes, Admiral Halsey was negligent, but it didn't rise to the level of a court-martial offense, that is, of negligence, that Admiral Nimitz's presence was instrumental in that finding. And it probably was, because Admiral Halsey was a bulldog. He was just the kind of commander that Admiral Nimitz wanted at the tip of the spear. He was taking the fight right to the Japanese, to the heart of the Japanese forces. And that's the kind of man that Nimitz wanted in command in the Western Pacific at that time. He was not about to see Admiral Halsey go down, and he protected him. In fact, later, as we'll see, he was responsible for Admiral Halsey getting a 5th star and later being appointed as a fleet admiral. The court, in announcing its findings, cited factors including that the storm moved to the ships at a very high rate of speed. There were shortcomings in forecast and warnings. There was a low fuel state of the ships. Again, they were like bobbing corks because they couldn't make headway with no fuel or low fuel. And very importantly, Admiral Halsey's exemplary service as a wartime commander. I'll just tell you a little bit about Admiral Halsey and how he got the name Bull. He was Admiral William F. Bull Halsey. And he got the name Bull. It was given to him by the journalists that covered him during the war. And he was known for his bull in the china shop style. And that's that moniker that the journalists gave him. Admiral Halsey had a motto: hit hard, hit fast, and hit often. That was the bull. Halsey was later promoted to fleet admiral, and there have been 2 warships named in his honor: a cruiser that was decommissioned in 1994 and a guided missile destroyer that is currently in service. And here's a picture of it, the USS Halsey. It's a guided missile destroyer. And there he is, the bull. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Naval historians are divided in their opinions about whether Halsey should have been sanctioned or not. But these are the armchair warriors later after the war, as the war receded and even after the war, who looked and said, you know, you should have done this and should have done that. But you know what? They weren't there. They weren't there. Halsey's men loved him. Nimitz loved him. He got the job done. But to this day, there does appear a cloud over his reputation. Nimitz got an aircraft carrier named after him. Halsey got a destroyer, just to give you some idea. So, unfortunately, for Admiral Halsey, there is this cloud that persists even to this day. And the important thing to note that that cloud was not put there by the enemy, it was put there by the weather. And I think at this point, we're probably ready to take your questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Was that the same fleet that went up to Okinawa to fight the Battle of Okinawa, which was also delayed by a typhoon, if I'm not mistaken?
You're absolutely correct. It was Halsey again. And it was Halsey, and then after the second typhoon, there was another court of inquiry. And Nimitz probably had to weigh in even a little heavier to save Halsey's butt. But, you know, he did it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Same fleet.
Bob, when you were talking about the Mayflower, did you mention that something about possible sabotage relating to that?
Thank you for following up on my suggestion that somebody ask that question. Yeah, the Mayflower set out with a sister ship called the Speedwell from England. And by the way, the Pilgrims, I forgot to mention, the Pilgrims actually started in Holland. That's where the Mayflower voyage started. They were from England, but they moved to Holland to get religious freedom, and that's where they started from. But the Speedwell was supposed to accompany the Mayflower, sort of a supply ship. The Speedwell was owned by a Dutch person or Dutch company. And one of the theories is the Dutch were concerned about the Mayflower settling in, you know, the mouth of the Hudson River when the Dutch had designs on it. They were also, the owner of the Speedwell, their owners were also concerned that Mayflower wasn't going to make it or would get destroyed when they got to the New World, and they'd lose the Speedwell as well. So they actually set off 2 or 3 times from England with the Speedwell, and the Speedwell kept developing this mysterious leaks. Water was pouring in, and they had to go back to shore 2 or 3 times. And eventually the Speedwell just fell off and never went with the Mayflower. And that's why the Mayflower didn't start its voyage until late September. And if you're going to land in Provincetown, Massachusetts in late November, that's probably not a really good idea.
Bob, I want to second a suggestion that you made to the audience. I too have read Philbrook's book. I haven't. I went on Amazon and I went on Amazon and bought it because it was such a good read. As Bob pointed out, it starts with the voyage of the Mayflower and all that, but the early history of the Pilgrims and how it went south with the Indians is discussed thoroughly in that book. I never knew any of that history at all. It's fascinating. So if you get a chance to get that book out of the library, or you want to buy it from Amazon for about $14-15, I would highly recommend it. It's a fantastic read. Thanks, Bob. Yes, sir.
Pat Hard, I'll bounce around here a little bit. First, an anecdote about Halsey. Fred and I were traveling and we stopped in Fredericksburg, Texas. There's a World War II museum there devoted to the Pacific Theater. It's small, but they had pictures of some of the admirals, the officers that were in command. And this group of, I guess they were like Oak-Hammock, it was senior citizens that were brought in. And there was a gentleman standing there and he was looking at them. And he said, he was a great man. And I said, did you know him? And he said, yes, he was a true hero. And he was talking about Halsey. And I found out later, I said, he had been a general, in the World War II. The other thing is the shuttle, the Challenger. Fred and I were coming back from Tallahassee. And of course, we'd lived in Orlando. We'd seen a lot of things go up. And even when one of the Fishers went up, we were allowed to go to the stands and whatnot. But we stopped at the rest stop to watch, as you said, you can see it. And we had listened to Cronkite on the radio until the launch. We got out to look and we were looking, and all of a sudden that squirrely cloud, and we knew something was wrong because we'd seen it. I ran back to the car and turned on the radio and it was dead silence. And then he said, it was Walter Cronkite, something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong. And the next shuttle, we were going to be in the same place. And we stopped in Gainesville to eat in a restaurant so we wouldn't see it go up. Kind of superstitious.
Okay.
Pat, I've been to that museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. That's a Nimitz museum. Fredericksburg, Texas was Nimitz' hometown. And it's a wonderful museum. I bought a shirt. I got a shirt from it. But you're right. There are fabulous items on display, fabulous pictures that depict the whole operation in the Pacific, the island hopping that occurred, all very well interpreted in that museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. Right.
Okay, we've exceeded our time, I see. So maybe if you have further questions, you could come up and talk to them afterwards. And thank you very much. Very interesting.